Seaman is all over Jordan Peterson and the all meat diet. With a last name like Seaman, you got to take advantage of it. This video is about the unnecessary confusion and chaos promoted by Beefy, Joe, Rogan, and radical vegans. Neither crew really understands the nature of the all meat diet. First and foremost, despite what people say, the all meat diet is hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. Now, the people who write about this clearly, well, they just don't get it, I guess. Here's some examples. It's absolutely insane. So, the Jordan Peterson all meat diet, as if Peterson made this up. You can see down below the subtitle from The Atlantic, the famous psychologist and his daughter swear by a regimen of eating only beef. Restriction can provide a sense of order in a world of chaos, but at what point does restriction become a disorder? Well, whoever authored this really should have looked into it a bit more careful, as should have the Petersons in terms of the history. So you Google carnivore or all meat diet, and this is what you get. Jordan Peterson's daughter says meat cures depression. Well, these people just don't get it. And there you can see Beefy Joe and Peterson on the Rogan show, and then whoever this guy is. It's terribly, terribly bad, says this guy, Tufano. Well, I mean, how could he know? Who really? I mean, it never ends. Now look at this. The bizarre fad diet taking the far right by storm. Right, so if you eat all meat, this must mean that you're a neo-Nazi. Oh, these poor people. Another one, the Guardian opinion. So why beef? My beef with Jordan Peterson's all-cow diet. Okay, so more madness. So this came from, I guess, a tweet that I pulled from Peterson himself. And more recently, Rhonda Patrick is on Joe Rogan's podcast, and they talk about, this is a small little clip. I don't want to listen to the whole thing, but this is about a 25-minute clip that he put up, and I'll show you all the errors and some of the mistakes that were made. So easier to go through this than the whole long podcast. Geez. Okay, so first 2 minutes, Rogan says all meat diet is relatively new. Wrong. Patrick says she dismissed it initially. Why? It's been hundreds, if not thousands of years old. At 2:30 into, she says that the carnivore diet is a low-carb, high-protein diet, which is exactly what it is not. It is not a high-protein diet in the context that you might think. I mean, that is wrong language. And at 11 minutes, she talks about the gut microbiota, issues if one's eating only amino acids. And this demonstrates the error in thinking that she has. It is not an all amino acid diet. She does not understand the nature of the all meat diet. At 11:26, she says the effects of a long-term all meat diet is not known. And Beefy Joe chimes in saying there are only anecdotal stories, both demonstrating their lack of knowledge of the history. So at 11:26 is where Joe chimes in. And then it continues on. Patrick at 7:45 talks about all meat being risky and unstudied. And Beefy Joe says her comprehensive breakdown that she's done for him has not been done regarding the carnivore diet. The question is, how could he know as a non-scientist? What does Joe know about the history of eating only meat? Okay, 1828, Rogan says, people do it for a year or two, but maybe setting themselves up for long-term damage. And of course, Patrick agrees, saying it is possible, but there is no data, and she has concerns. No data, incorrect. She says, by doing this, eating only meat, your hypothesis is that all plants are bad. See, this is the problem when people look at diet from the perspective of embracing certain foods. They really do not properly embrace, and Patrick should, because she's quite smart, obviously, that diet is about physiology, and you should look at diet from the window of physiology, not from the window of the plant or beef or whatever food it is that you want to eat. 21:55, they talk about the carnivore diet being related to caloric restriction. Well, it could be, but historically wrong again. And at 22:30, Patrick says she eats a modified paleo diet. Here's the thing about all this paleo diet business. Beefy Joe needs to interview Lauren Cordain. None of Beefy Joe's paleo buddies are scientists, even though they sort of portray that they are. And at 24 minutes in, almost at the end, Patrick again says that eating an all-meat diet is completely unstudied. What she is not understanding about the Petersons is that they backed into eating only meat because of their pro-inflammatory reactions to all other calories. The Petersons never said that they decided to stop eating vegetables because they are bad. They did it because of their autoimmune state that they were dealing with. Now, for me, because I'm not like a big, I have small presence in the land of social media and the internet. 2017, I sent this tweet to Rogan. He had some other guy on there talking about all meat. And so the tweet to Rogan was, all meat diet is old news. Stefansson checked into Bellevue in like 1930, 1925, where he ate only meat for a year. And this was highly controlled. And this is after spending time doing the same in the Arctic. Stefansson ate meat exclusively for almost 9 years, and I gave Rogan the article that he could have read to have cleared all this up. But the question is, why is this so confusing? And it depends upon who you get your information from. This is one of the sources that Rogan gets his information from. In the early days, following Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Diet, Lose Weight and Get Healthy by Eating the Food You're Designed to Eat, the paleo diet was considered to be moderate in carbohydrate and low in saturated fat, though monounsaturated fat wasn't restricted. So then we're told we should stop talking about the paleo diet and think as a paleo template. Why is this person saying this? Because allegedly, which is incorrect by the way, a paleo diet implies a particular approach with clearly defined parameters that all people, here it is, all people should follow. There's little room for individual variation or experimentation. Absolutely incorrect. Now, where did this come from? This came from one of Joe Rogan's, one of Beefy Joe's non-paleo scientist friends who's never published a scientific article ever. So let's just break down a couple of those statements. So the first statement, okay, so moderate in carbohydrate, low in saturated fat, although monounsaturated fat wasn't restricted. Well, this is a completely ridiculous statement, and here's why. Let's take olive oil and avocado. Both of these fat sources, oil sources, are mostly monounsaturated fatty acids. Oleic acid is the fatty acid. Well, you cannot just simply grab a bottle or a handful of monounsaturated fatty acids. No food contains only monounsaturated fatty acids. So if you eat more olive oil, you'll also be getting more saturated fat. So this conception is a really poor conception of the paleo diet. There is another poor conception that Beefy Joe's buddy brought up that I'll show you in a second. So here it is. What's the difference? A paleo diet implies a particular approach with clearly defined parameters that all people should follow, little variation. Well, how ridiculous is that statement? So let's look at where Peterson is from. Fairview, Canada, I guess Alberta. And I also have Gimli here. Anyone who has any notion about the all-meat diet should know who is from Gimli. But let's just look at this. I mean, you're in Fairview right now. I just pulled this up the other day. 25 degrees. So I think I'm doing this on Wednesday morning early. Right now in Fairview, it's 21 degrees. It'll be 17 this Sunday. So what kind of food do you figure grows up at Gimli? Or if you go into the Arctic Circle more east, and I'll show you that in a little while. Well, depending upon where you are from, the paleo diet is massively varied based upon what lives, the animals and the fish, the birds that live there, and the vegetation that grows there. It changes based upon one's climate. It has nothing to do with being a defined parameter that all people should follow. So my suggestion is that to get your proper paleo diet information, you get it from the proper paleo diet source, not people who are marketers of paleo concepts. So this is where you should go. pictured here on in the left, this is Dr. Lauren Cordain, the founder of the movement. This is Dr. Mark Smith, Cordain's first physiology PhD student, who got his PhD during the beginning of Cordain's movement into the paleo diet. And this was Trevor Connor. This is Cordain's last graduate student before Cordain retired. So why am I suggesting you go here? To get proper information about the paleo diet and go nowhere else. And if you also want to see part of the reason why it got confused, you can read the article that they just posted that I wrote for them. I'm an outsider of the paleo movement. This is an outsider's view, and I describe the errors that non-paleo scientists make. So what Beefy Joe should do is he should take the names of his nutrition-related scientists who he has on the show and put their name into PubMed to see if they have any research game at all, and therefore scientific game when it comes to whatever topic they're going to be talking about. So let me show you what you do if you put Cordain's name into PubMed. You get 66 papers. None of Rogan's paleo-type promoters publish any articles that are scientific in nature. And this whole thing now that Rogan's getting into, the whole ketogenic diet, he should have the original scientist on his show. And if he had the original scientist, do you know what his name is? Does anyone know what his name is if anyone's listening to this? Here's his name, Stephen Phinney. He wrote his first paper on the ketogenic diet back in like 1980 or 82, so 30-some years ago, 36 years ago or 38 years ago is when he wrote his first paper on this. And if Rogan had listened to Phinney, there would be no issue with this all-meat diet thing. It would be all clear. Wouldn't need to have Patrick come on and deliver her misinterpretation of it, because that's not her field anyway. It's not her field, so it's hard to find good information unless it is your field. And it's, I don't understand why DiAgostino did not clue this up for Rogan, because he's a keto guy, so he should have also have known what Phinney talked about. All right, so we have this scenario about the all-meat diet, and you have poor Jordan Peterson. This is from back in 2015. And the reason why I like Peterson is because he's a psychologist and he appreciates that life is suffering. So that's my interest in him. And so his viewpoints move from that perspective rather than this positive attitude kind of thing, because, well, life is filled with trauma and catastrophes. Now, if you look right here, you can see why Peterson was suffering. He's about, I don't know if he's 50 pounds heavier now, but allegedly he was a 210, 220 at one point before he shredded down to 160. So he's sucking back Diet Coke, clearly not the best way to roll. And if you're sucking back Diet Coke, you know he's eating other hypercaloric food. So just overeating sugar, flour, and refined oil, which is the big problem for the average person. This is what happens. Look at what I have here below. Whole food, heavily loaded by vegetables, fruit, and fish, versus sweetened desserts, fried food, processed meat, refined grains, and they threw high-fat dairy in there. Not an issue if you're calorically appropriate. So they found that the processed food diet was predictive for depression expression 5 years later. So it's not a surprise that Peterson had depression. The dude had 50 pounds of fat mass on him. That's inflammatory. And though he was not obese, he's not a big guy. If you weigh 210, 220, your BMI is below 30, which was the cutoff for obesity, but it would be in the high 20s, 28, 29, which means he's overweight. And if you have small bones, he looks like he doesn't have big bones. I don't have big bones. If I weighed 210, I'm 6'2". If I weighed 210, 220 with 50 pounds more fat on me, I might not be obese, but I would be in a state of metabolic obesity because of my small bone structure. So let's look at the outcomes of obesity and why it is a problem. So this is published by researchers in the Department of Orthopedics at the University of Florida. Go Gators. Look at the title, Chronic Pain, Obese Patient, Challenges and Potential. So let's look what they talk about here. So obesity is associated with several negative psychological alterations, pain, catastrophizing, fear. They could have thrown depression in there as well, but they did not. Common characteristics in an obese person with pro-inflammatory conditions include fatigue, lethargy, social withdrawal, irritability. Why? It's because obesity chemistry is pro-inflammatory chemistry. And a better way to describe this, I'll show you why my comment on this is correct in a moment. A better way to describe this is to state that obesity is an inflammatory state. And with an inflammatory state, symptoms of that inflammatory state will manifest, those being those psychological symptoms. Now look what happens here. As body mass index and fat volume increases, macrophages in adipose tissue, enter adipose tissue, and behave like an infection is present. Average person is not aware of this, that obesity is a brutal pro-inflammatory state from many perspectives. Achilles, patella, elbow tendinopathies are related to the presence of metabolic syndrome. Inflammation is a state that fosters nociception. For those of you who don't know, nociception means the reception of noxious stimuli or injurious-like stimuli. It can be purely biochemical without any damage. And as a consequence, inflammation prevents healing. So, where did they get this information from? Well, they got this information from reference number 47. All the yellow ones I just highlighted were reference 47. And who is reference 47? Reference 47 is me. This is my paper. And here is the actual paper, body mass index and musculoskeletal pain. Is there a connection? And in this article, I present this list of markers of chronic inflammation. So the best way to look at diet is not to sit there and debate about vegetables versus fat versus meat and on and on and on. The way people do is to base one's diet and whether or not one's lifestyle is healthy based upon known direct markers or surrogate markers of inflammation. So where did this diet and inflammation thing begin? This is a paper published by researchers at the CDC, Harvard Med School, and Harvard School of Public Health. It was published online in 2004 and in 2005. And so back then there was very little on diet and inflammation. So you can see how they cited it in terms of the available research. You have to realize that people at the CDC and Harvard, they get access to every article that was ever published. So here's what they say. Research has shown that nutrition can affect inflammation. They cite Grimble, they cite Chung, and they cite me, my 2002 paper, which was the first paper that was ever published, that kind of looked at diet in a more broad view rather than just omega-3 fatty acids or antioxidants. And here is the paper published in 2002. Note the words that were used here. The diet induced pro-inflammatory state. State refers to an ongoing biologic state, not just I have inflammation and I take fish oil and it goes away. It doesn't work like that. A diet-induced pro-inflammatory state. So these two papers and two others formed the basis for this book that I wrote, which would not necessarily be helpful for the Petersons because the suggestion is to replace your refined food calories with vegetation. And they dumped vegetation as well. But for the average person, this recommendation works perfectly and is described in a fashion of inflammation versus defending or arguing against certain foods. The same 4 articles that I wrote informed me such that I could write this article, this book also, which is, this is my brother who was massively obese due to brutal spasmodic torticollis. He shredded down to 190. This was back in 2007, and he has remained at this weight since that time. I'm not going to read these, but over here next to the DeFlame diet book, you see the reasons why we are fat. By the way, this is a free Kindle book if you have Amazon Prime, or it is just 99 cents. You can read more about it at my website. You can click here for the DeFlame book, here for the weight loss book, and you can get, when you get to the page, you can click the drop down button for volumes or just get one book if you have. So let's get back to Peterson. So here he is again, overweight, inflamed. I mean, the guy's like sweating, his eyeballs are all glassy and messed up, and poor guy back then, suffering with depression and likely aches and pains and fatigue. And then he changes what he's eating, motivated by his daughter, and then 3 years later, here he is. Look how different he looks. Well, he's tanned up, obviously, but totally different look. And here's his daughter. Now look at what Rogan says. The carnivorous diet cured his depression? And then uh, uh, his daughter, Michaela, was on Rogan's show as well, and neither of them seemed to grasp. And there's a good reason for this. It's not easy to find, and all of Rogan's buddies don't seem to grasp the actual nature of this carnivore diet or the actual history. But let's consider the fact that Peterson has depression, perhaps some other autoimmune factors. Depression typically is not an autoimmune condition. It is bidirectional with autoimmune disease because autoimmunity is a pro-inflammatory state and depression is a pro-inflammatory state. So it's not surprising that that Peterson was helped. His depression was helped by eating all meat or meat and vegetables, and his daughter far worse scenario. So if one has rheumatoid disease, in this case rheumatoid arthritis, you could go way back to 1991 and look at this Lancet paper, Controlled Trial of Fasting, 1-year vegetarian diet. And by the way, during that 1 year, many people had to become lacto-ovo because it's very difficult to maintain a proper caloric balance on just vegetables and fruit. But what they found was that within 1 month, the group that went on this program, they went into remission with their rheumatoid arthritis. This wouldn't have worked for the Petersons. They, because they both described, or at least the daughter described, how vegetables were screwing her up. So all of a sudden, allegedly, this thing is new because Peterson is new and his daughter is new, at least on internet and wherever else, and therefore this must be new. Well, that's quite wrong. Shockingly wrong. So if you want to learn about the all-meat diet, you need to read Stefansson's book, The Fat of the Land. This was published in 1960. I think the first edition was earlier on. Well, who is Stefansson? Remember I showed you early on, Gimli, Canada. This is where Stefansson is from. He was born 1879, died 1962. Look at his books. My Life with the Eskimo, 1913. The Friendly Arctic, 1921. The Fat of the Land, Not by Bread Alone, and Hunters of the Great North. You can see when they were all published. So this is the man that people should be citing rather than saying, well, there's no evidence on this and blah, blah, blah. It's ridiculous. So that's why I showed you Gimli earlier on, because Stefansson clears up, his work clears up all this stupidity that people are yakking about when it relates to the all-meat diet. So can you find an actual scientific paper on this? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, yes. 1930. Prolonged meat diets with the study of kidney function and ketosis. Well, there you go. So if Beefy Joe Rogan got Stephen Phinney, who's MD, PhD, who is the grandfather of the ketogenic diet, on his show, or listened to any of his YouTube videos, Beefy Joe could have learned that the all-meat diet is not a protein diet, not even close. And you'll see what I mean in a couple of seconds. So this is a free article, by the way. Anybody who wants to read this easily can. So in this article, we're told that it's well known that the Eskimos have lived on an almost exclusive meat diet for generations. Bam, there you go. So Stefansson and his companions, as a consequence of his experience, Stefansson wrote the book, The Friendly Arctic. Look at this, 11 years in Arctic exploration. During 9 years, Stefansson lived almost exclusively on meat. So Stefansson and Anderson, who was also on one of Stefansson's later expeditions, they both voluntarily agreed to eat nothing but meat for 1 year while they continued their usual activities in the temperate climate of New York. Well, temperate for if you're from Gimli or Fairview, but not if you're from Texas or Florida or Southern California or Arizona. Not so temperate. Anyway, so guess where Stefansson ate his foods? He ate his foods at Bellevue Hospital, which was not a loony bin back in before 1930. So Stefansson took his meals in the ward at Bellevue, but he slept at home. In February 26, 1928, Stefansson started his all-meat diet. At our request, at the researchers' request, he began eating lean meat only. Although, now you say lean meat only, correct? Think about this. This is what Rhonda Patrick got wrong. It's not an amino acid diet. So this misperception persists to today. So the scientists back then said, hey, Stefanson, you got to just eat lean meat. And Stefanson said, well, I've noted previously that in the North, very lean meat sometimes produces digestive disturbances on the third day. Nausea and diarrhea developed in Stefanson, so when fat was added to the diet, a full recovery was made. And there you have it. Fat is the key component of this all meat diet. People seem not to be able to comprehend this for some reason. So there you go. Very lean meat sometimes produces digestive disturbances. When fat was added back, full recovery was made in 2 days. So, what meats were consumed by Stefanson and Anderson? Beef, lamb, veal, pork, chicken. And they used muscle, liver, kidney, brain, bone marrow, bacon for you bacon lovers, and cut off fat. So while on lecture trips, Stefanson occasionally ate a few eggs and a little butter when meat was not readily obtainable. So you heard me say before, bit by bit, where Rogan and Patrick talked about it being a caloric restriction diet, and that's probably why it's beneficial and blah, blah, which is true. Caloric restriction is beneficial, but the idea that this all-meat diet is a calorically restricted diet is not correct unless you do it that way on purpose. It's not just it's caloric restriction or caloric excess or neutral. It depends upon your caloric needs. Geez. Okay, so 2 men lived on an exclusive meat diet for 1 year. Relative amounts of lean and fat meat were left to the choices of the individuals. So let's look at what they did. Protein content, so amino acids, as Patrick said, it's not an amino acid diet. How do you know? Because they consume 200 to 300 grams of fat. And with 9 calories per gram of fat, that's 1,800 calories. 1,800 calories per day to 2,700 calories per day from fat. And it varied, of course. And then you had less calories, 400 to a little more than 400 calories on average per day from meat. So depending upon the day, the diet ranged from 2,000 to 3,100 calories. So if Michaela Peterson ate 2,000 calories of meat per day, she would not have shredded down, nor would Jordan if he consumed 3,100 calories per day. So this is not the historical use of the all-meat diet had nothing to do with trying to lose weight or deal with autoimmune disease. It's based upon the location of the Eskimos in the Arctic Circle who Stefanson lived with for years and years and years. So let's get back to Peterson. So here he is, swollen, inflamed, suffering, depressed. So what is it that causes autoimmunity? This is something that needs to be understood. It's multifactorial, multivariant, so Peterson should love this. So here you have rheumatoid arthritis. What drives it? Well, gender. So females tend to have more autoimmune disease than males. Men, when they flame up, and that's typically by getting fat. I'll show you how this works in a little while. Fat men tend to become more hormonally feminized compared to lean men. And plus you have to have the genes for it. You got to be stressed, who isn't? And then infective agents. Now, when you see infective agents, people tend to think, oh man, I got to have a fever. Not necessarily, because you can live at a low-grade infection chemistry, which you can watch here if you wish. This is a video I did a couple years ago, the DeFlame Diet Basics. And endotoxin is enough to jack you into a pro-inflammatory state and push autoimmune expression if you have all the other factors associated with it. And look, you can see what happens here. When you live on these calories, which the average person does, you eventually become deficient in these nutrients, and you get a robust increase in absorbed endotoxin, which is pro-inflammatory and jacks up inflammation through toll-like receptors and nuclear factor kappa B and a whole bunch of different signaling mechanisms. So the main thing to understand when it comes to diet and inflammation is that, and this is the best language that you could use, following a hypercaloric challenge. Following a hypercaloric challenge, hypothalamic microglia, astrocytes enter a reactive state, and this reactive state means a pro-inflammatory state, and this persists when you're obese. So when you're obese or overweight, or when you're overweight but metabolically obese, you live basically in an autoimmune-like state. And we know this because you can see pictures of this. This is lean adipose tissue, anti-inflammatory immune cells, helper 2 cells, T regulatory cells, interleukin-10, highly anti-inflammatory. When you become overweight and obese, look what happens, particularly when you are fully obese. There are no more anti-inflammatory immune cells, and what appears are your pro-inflammatory cytotoxic T cells, which show up for cancer and viral infections, and helper 1 cells, which are your stereotypical, prototypical autoimmune T cell. And it happens to macrophages also. Lean, healthy adipocytes are associated with anti-inflammatory macrophages, dumping out beautiful IL-10, highly anti-inflammatory, adiponectin, a brutally anti-inflammatory adipokine that is required for proper insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle, mitochondrial biogenesis in skeletal muscle. But when we lose these anti-inflammatory macrophages and we get replacement by pro-inflammatory macrophages, you can see the cytokines that explode outward, among other chemicals. So when you look at a guy like this, no wonder this is called adiposeopathy. So Harold Bayes coined this term. This is what happens when we overeat. And so this guy here is living in a low-grade infection, low-grade autoimmune state. And in the case of Jordan Peterson, this would lead to depression. So here's how it works briefly. Here's a picture from this article. Free paper, by the way, if you want to get it. I'm going to zoom right in on the depression image. So here are your pro-inflammatory cytokines. What they do is they cause tryptophan to be converted down the pro-inflammatory kynurenine pathway. This means we make less serotonin. Less serotonin is released as well, and then serotonin is more rapidly taken up. So now we have a relative insufficiency of serotonin, which is why serotonin reuptake inhibitors or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors are prescribed to keep the serotonin banging against the postsynaptic cells receptors as opposed to being taken up. So this is why Peterson has depression, most likely. So when one decides to move in the direction that Peterson moved in, you will get the radical vegan. So we saw how Beefy Joe messed this whole thing. And now look at how the radical vegans screw up this whole thing. So this guy, Gregor, is a smart guy. The problem is that he is a radical vegan meat hater. So he writes this article recently on his website. It is the Eskimo myth. So he talks about omega-3s and how they just accepted that it was omega-3s. And he says that the omega-3 issue, a concept that has been disproven over and over back in the 1930s. So what you should do, because I was asked questions about this, what do you think about this? Well, you should read the paper and see. So all you got to do is click on disproven, and it takes you to the PubMed article. You can download the article, and this is the article that Gregor says disproves the health of those on the traditional Eskimo diet. Okay, so let's look at where you can see this is the Arctic Circle. Below that is not. So this is where Stefansson spent his time, up here in the Arctic Circle, way, way, way north. And this is where you can see that, what's the name? Rabinowitz, how they looked at the Eskimo diet in all these various locations. And so it's important to understand that when you're further south, you will be more exposed to modern foods compared to up north. Now remember, Gregor said, this proves that Eskimo diet is not healthy. Well, he's wrong too. Smart guy, very wrong, because he is ideologically possessed by the vegan diet, which is referred to as a plant-based diet. They should just be honest and just say, I'm a vegan. Or even say, I'm a radical vegan. I hate meat, but I have poor evidence for that. So how do we know that? Diseases amongst Eskimos. A very striking example of the influence of contact with civilized man is seen when the diseases met with Hudson's Bay and Straits compared with those of the more northernly regions of the eastern Arctic. So you see what we're being told here? Civilized man, so-called civilized man brings diseases associated with civilized diet, which is sugar, flour, and refined oils. Back then, mostly sugar and flour. So the majority of the natives at these posts, these are the southern posts, not the northern posts. This is where they were exposed to flour. The majority of the natives at these posts were pale, according to hematological findings. There's no reason to suspect that pernicious anemia. So they were pale and unhealthy. Okay, whereas in the northern parts of Baffin Island, the colors of the skins and mucous membranes were not only good, but many of the natives looked plethoric, which in this context it was used to describe a rosiness, a healthy robustness of the northern Eskimos eating only meat, which were high in omega-3s, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what Gregor said, because Gregor maybe didn't read this because he's so biased against meat. So what do we know about food availability up there? So at Lake Harbor, seals, I was told, are found in abundance about 8 miles from the post. Walrus are also available. So of the 26 tents that they looked at in this northern zone, flour was found in only one. You go south, closer to civilized man. So at Port Boro, where aside from very intimate contact with white men throughout the year, hunting conditions are poor for seal, poor for walrus. What are you going to do? Eat flour. So the problem with the whole Eskimo thing is that you need to look at the traditional Eskimos rather than the Eskimos that he's talking about. And you'll also find out if you read this article that the northern Eskimos living on the traditional whale, seal, and fish, and whatever else they eat, which is largely meat, fish, sea mammals, they are healthy. Now, in this article, they describe these northern Eskimos as having filthy teeth, filthy teeth, but no cavities. And then you go down to the flour-eating southern Eskimos, clean teeth because they got dentists there, riddled with cavities. So we know the issue is, of course, obviously, flour. And if you throw flour, sugar, refined oils, you can see that is the total disaster, not meat. So Beefy Joe and his paleo and non-paleo and keto guys, they missed the point about this all-meat diet. It's a high-fat diet. It is not a protein diet. And then the radical vegan, Gregor, he misses the point too. So this Eskimo myth, he is wrong about. What do we know? We know that more flour equals disease. The Eskimo meat diet or omega-3s are not even at issue in this article. Now, when it comes to me, if a radical vegan hops in here, they're going to probably start hurling pejoratives because that's how people roll for whatever reason. So this is a nod to the vegans. They seem not to get this. If you eat meat, it does not mean that you only eat meat. You eat meat, and if you're smart, you would eat vegetation. Well, what would you eat? Well, it depends upon where you live. So where I live, I can eat figs right off my tree if I want. This is a view of my backyard. You can see this is a papaya tree here, papaya leaf. This is a fig leaf. These guys here, this is lemongrass. Let's take a shot closer. We'll jump over the lemongrass, look backwards there. We can see this is aloe. There's a prickly pear. They're edible, growing here. We've got kiwis. These are avocados. Sweet potatoes growing there. This is just areca palms. And then over here is what I'm going to focus on now. What's growing over here in this box? Well, before stuff was growing, it was just dirt, and then I took a picture of the turmeric roots that I was planting, and then shortly thereafter, bam, turmeric is growing, highly anti-inflammatory, very advisable to add turmeric and ginger to your meat. So let's go to the back area of the yard. And here you can see turmeric growing like crazy that I planted earlier this year. To the right, if you want something sweet, this is stevia. This little bit here you can hardly see sticking out this way is katuk. Here is citrus. This is moringa. Back in here, this is ginger. And these are avocados. And here are the avocados that I've pulled right off my trees. Here are papayas growing on my trees. Another view. I mean, if you're a radical vegan now, you should not be dropping down the hate on me because you can see I got more food trees than most people combined on the street. So here you can see avocados, apples, plums, peaches, pears, bananas, moringa, figs. What else? Cherry hedge. So all kinds of stuff is growing like crazy there. Now, these radical vegans in their What the Health video, they talk about the Kemper diet, and it's basically a sugar and rice diet, and it's so healthy. Well, they kind of missed that point too, because if you look at the paper properly, all these people lost weight. So, but a nod to fruits because they love them. They love, well, I'm sure they love bananas. This is a big ass banana tree. When I had this planted, it was two stalks, two trees coming out. One was, this is a 6 foot high fence. One was 6 foot high. The other one was this big. Now I got a massive clump. Now here you can see the banana fruit, and over here you can see banana bunch. There's another banana bunch over here. I'll show you that in a second. So let's zoom in on the banana flower. So the banana flower is where you get the bananas from, and you can actually eat the banana flower as well. But as these layers of the banana flower leaves pop up, little bananas pop out, and eventually it looks like this. Down here, I cut off the flower because once you stop making these, you want to have all the energy of the tree going to ripen and fill out the bananas. On the other side of this big clump, here you have another clump. And I got like 6 of these growing, so I got lots of bananas. So you could also, what I also do is you drink a lot of vegetable juice. And down below here you can see turmeric. So clearly I am not a radical meat eater. Now, I don't think that Peterson is a radical meat eater, by the way. It's just that Peterson and his daughter apparently cannot do this because of their pro-inflammatory state. So the best thing for people to do, in my view, from a really, which I think is a non-biased view, is identify your markers of inflammation and identify the diet that works best for you. My suggestion, of course, is to take my approach at eating and then the mental state for weight loss. If this does not work for you, I would suggest that you get Lauren Cordain's book, the only worthwhile paleo diet book to read, called The Paleo Diet, and get your information from him. And Rogan, if he happens to listen to this, he should have Cordain on his podcast to get the real deal on the paleo diet, and he should have Stephen Finney on his show so that he can be educated about Stefansson and the proper nature of the all meat diet.